Welcome to part 2, Dissolving and Melting Geometry with Rigid Bodies in Houdini. In the first part, we set up a simulation to scale down packed RBD objects at the pre-solve stage, along with breaking their corresponding constraints. In this section, we'll set up fluid sourcing and run a flip simulation to complete the effect. So let's get started. Okay, a couple things I've done. To start with, I've added a few more scatter points. We're at 1,000 now, and that's just so we can have a little bit smoother effect. I've also moved the start position for the growth solve to the back lower part of the neck. The idea being the effect will start at the back, the head will lean backward, and the last thing we'll see as it melts away will be the face. So this is the preview of the growth solve right now. Let's take a look at that. Yeah, I think that'll work for us. All right, next, let's set up the exports from the RBD DOP sim. So put down transform pieces. A DOP import. Let's add a null up here and call it static RBD. Time shift. Set this to the first frame of your sim. In our case, that's frame 1. So this will go into the final input of transform pieces. That'll be our rest point. And we'll put template points into the second input. And then we'll object merge our static RBD. This will go into the first input. It's also, simplest thing would be just drag the DOPNet into here and then make sure we're referencing this packed RBD object. So Control C. Control V on Windows. And also make sure you create points to represent objects. Let's take a look. And there we are. So now we can set up the sourcing for the flip sim. Lay down a debris source. We'll pipe that in and turn on interior group. Set the density scale to 3000 and maybe a smaller distance threshold, 0.01. Lifespan at 1 is fine for now, and remove unreleased and remove at life end. We'll need a p-scale attribute, so let's add a wrangle. F of p-scale equals the channel value. Maybe 0.03 for the moment. We'll have to come back and adjust that later. Let's call that set p-scale. And then a VDB from particle. And this will be our flip source VDB. Turn down our minimum radius to 0.01 for now, and a voxel size the same. Copy this, and this will be our vel source. So grab velocity. into this VDB because we're generating velocities from our debris source here. So add a point attribute and set this to V, and we'll call it vel. Flip dop source. We'll need to get our radius from p-scale. Some oversampling won't hurt. And a voxel size of 0.01. Now let's set up our flip sim, lay down a dop, not a dop import, a dop net. Here we are, pretty standard dop net for doing a flip sim. Let's name this volume source volume vel. This one will be our actual volume source. We want to grab the second input for the velocity and the first input for the volume source. Let's turn off display proxy geometry for the ground plane, and in the flip object, delete this SOP path. We won't need that. And maybe particle separation of 0.03 for now. Well, let's leave that at 1 just for preview purposes for the moment. We'll also need to bring in our velocity here. Source vel to vel, make sure that's a vector. And here you can just use initialize preset, just source flip, and that'll give us source volume surface to target field surface, and that should be fine for now. In the flip solver, in the volume motion, let's set the domain. Don't need it to be that big. I think what was working for me is maybe 6 by 4 by 6. Box center at Y2. And then in particle motion, a little bit more oversampling. Let's set that to 4 for now. Volume motion, velocity smoothing, could use a little bit more, maybe 0.5. So let's jump out, wire the flip source into the first input, and vel source into the second. And let's take a quick look. One thing we'll need to do, copy and paste the name of your flip object here. Just make sure that's the only thing being exported. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and combine the output of this flip sim with the head, because it'll be easier to make these adjustments if we can see everything in context. Let's add a null here. We can call this unpacked RBD. Copy the path to that, object merge. Now, we could just wire this directly down, but I like to use object merges like this just to keep things clean. We'll need a VDB from polygons. .01 voxel size for the moment. And then a VDB from particles, taking the output from our flip sim. Let's call this flip sim. Set the minimum radius again to 0.01. and the voxel size also. VDB combine. And we'll get the minimum. So everything is pretty chunky right now. Our P-scale size is a little crazy. Let's adjust that next. Just jump in here, and we're going to copy parameter for our particle separation and paste that into P-scale. Paste relative reference. Do the same in the VDB. Paste relative reference. Val source too. And in the flip source, which I've actually already done here. Also, let's put a VDB smooth. SDF. Right here, take a look. It's a little bit better. Still a little bit lumpy. We'll need to add a little more resolution. One thing we can do also is, it's a little bit fast, the flip sim. Let's change our time scale to 0.5. And maybe later on we'll use some sub-steps. Let's try this for now. Again, this is all very subjective. It's going to depend a lot on the geometry you're using. So these are just some parameters that seem to work for me. Looking better. At this stage, we can bring in a little more resolution overall. So here, the VDB from polygons, we'll cut this in half. Copy parameter and paste that into the VDB from particles. Paste relative reference. In the flip source here, let's also take the particle separation of the flip sim. I'm going to paste it here. Paste relative reference. But we're going to divide that. Or actually just multiply that by 0.5, so it's half. And the flip source, that should be fine for now. Inside the flip sim, one thing I did that seemed to help also is stick on collision, and you'll have to play with a stick scale to see what works, but let's try 0.25. That's looking a lot better. Another thing we can do here is add a VDB reshape. SDF. And set this to close. Value of an offset of 4. We'll just smooth things out and make things a little bit less lumpy. And before we run the sim, let's make a few changes to the sourcing. So instead of just sourcing a p-scale value, let's set a ramp based on the age that's coming in from the debris source. So let's comment this out for now. We'll fit the age into a range that we can work with. Starting at 0 and adding a channel value we can change. We'll call that max age. Map that to 0 to 1 so we can use that in a ramp. Age ramp. And then we'll set the p-scale with that. Multiplied by this attribute, by this value that we set. So we want it to come in pretty quickly to scale up. Let's turn these into B-splines. Let's take a look. Set max age to 1. Yeah, so now you can see our particle sources are scaling up. And even though the flip solver doesn't take p-scale, this will give us a smoother result because the sourcing will come in a little bit smoother. So let's run our sim. So here's what we got. Looking pretty good, looking pretty gross. One thing I did do here in the flip sim, I went with a particle separation of 0.15. And again, at this stage, it's all really subjective, whatever works in your situation. One thing we will do here, we'll need to transfer velocities to the mesh. Let's merge RBD objects and the output from the flip sim. And that's going to transfer velocities to the mesh. So let's take a look. Yeah, so now we have velocities. You'll need that for motion blur. And if you have anything else, CD or UVs, you'll need to transfer those to the mesh as well. So that about wraps it up. If you have any other suggestions, any tips or tricks, anything was unclear, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll catch you next time.